Hey guys, you can see below what SOL number 3 is and what we're going to be learning about with studying the Reformation. So we're going to talk about theological, political, and economic differences that emerged during the Reformation. We're going to talk about some different people like John Calvin, Martin Luther, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. We're going to talk about religious conflicts in the Inquisition and the Catholic Reformation. And then last, we're going to talk about how the Reformation left lasting impacts on cultural values, traditions, and philosophies. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the printing press and the effects that it had on the Reformation and the Renaissance even. So today we're going to start talking about the causes of the Reformation. First of all, what is the Reformation? The Reformation is a movement. It's a movement for reform within the Catholic Church or of the Catholic Church. It started with a guy named Martin Luther who was a Catholic priest, and he saw some things that he didn't really agree with happening in the church. So essentially he did some things. We're going to talk about him a little later, so I'm not going to be so specific, but he did some things, and it caused this big movement to happen that he wasn't even expecting, and essentially new churches were created throughout all of Europe, and even the Catholic Church itself saw some reform because of his actions and what happened. So at the basics, it's a reform of the Catholic Church, and it took power away from the Catholic Church and changed the face of religion in Europe forever. So that's just kind of the basics of what the Reformation itself is. So now let's move into the causes of the Reformation. So some changes in society. We talked with the Renaissance about those trade patterns that were happening. They started in Italy and moved throughout the rest of Northern Europe. And along those trade routes, cities started popping up, towns started popping up, and the traders, the merchants who were trading goods along those routes, were becoming really, really wealthy because people wanted those goods. And so when they were becoming more wealthy, people wanted to borrow money from them, and the merchants wanted to lend people money because that's how they're going to make more money. And the practice of lending money and charging interest for that loan is called usury. Usury was frowned upon by the Catholic Church. It was actually it was prohibited by church doctrine. Catholics weren't supposed to loan money and charge interest, so only Jewish people were doing that at the time. But these merchants wanted to loan money, and people wanted them to lend money. So they were challenging the authority of the Catholic Church when they started lending people money, because they did. They started doing it anyway. So that kind of was a big change in society, was the development of these towns, wealth being accumulated by people other than kings and the church, and these people kind of making their own decisions and following their own free will to make these decisions. So next, people were questioning the church. The church was super dominated by the Italians. It was pretty much all the leadership of the church was Italians, and that really upset a lot of people, especially kings in other countries like France and Germany and England, who kind of were, upset that they were having to answer to this foreign power of the church, but more specifically, the Italians who were dominating the church. And not only were they upset about the power of the church, but the Catholic Church owned land all over Europe and all of these countries. And so kings in other countries would charge taxes, just like we have to pay taxes to the United States today and to the state of Virginia. Kings charged their people taxes. That's how kings made money. But the kings couldn't charge the church taxes on that land that they owned in their country, because if they were charging the church taxes, then it would be like they were above the church, they were above God, and you can't do that. You just can't. So they were kind of upset that there was this land in their country, and this really wealthy church owned their land, and they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't make any money from it. So people were kind of upset, specifically kings were upset about the Italian domination of the Catholic Church. And kind of going along with that, the church was really wealthy and powerful. At this time, the Catholic Church was really wealthy and really powerful. And people were kind of upset about that. Especially when they started showing that wealth and power in some kind of questionable ways. They were waging wars to get more land for the church. They were spending money on really lavish, unnecessary things like commissioning artwork and building massive cathedrals, things that didn't really help people get to heaven, didn't really promote or, further people's life as a Catholic, but the church was still spending a lot of money on it. So that was upsetting people too. There are also all these corrupt practices going on in the church that made people kind of question what was going on. So the way that the church was set up, you had big leadership, but your everyday person came into contact typically just with their parish priest or their local priest. So there'd be a local church set up in your town. You'd have a church in the town of Stewart-Strath, and we have a parish priest there who is our local priest. Well, these priests in particular were really uneducated. Most of them, or a lot of them, couldn't read, which meant that they weren't really reading the Bible to the people coming to the church. They weren't educated themselves, so how are they supposed to educate other people? On top of being uneducated, they were marrying and having children, which in the Catholic Church, priests aren't allowed to marry. So it was kind of a big no-no for these priests to be marrying and having children, especially. And even people could buy positions in the Catholic Church, these smaller parishes and these parish priest positions. The wealthy were buying them for their sons and for people in their family to have a position in the church. So a lot of these practices people were kind of questioning and saying, well, if our priests aren't even following Catholic doctrine, then why should I be following Catholic doctrine? And lastly, the last thing that made people question the church were the sale of indulgences. Again, Martin Luther comes into play with the sale of indulgences, but we'll talk about that specifically in our next video. But essentially, an indulgence is a pass. It's a pass that people would buy to shorten their time in purgatory before they went to heaven. So let's break that down a little bit. The Catholics believed that after you died, you waited in this place called purgatory before you went to heaven. And you waited in purgatory for a certain amount of time based on the sins you committed in your life. So how many sins and how bad your sins were determined how long you would stay in purgatory before you went to heaven. So these indulgences that people thought shortened their time in purgatory and helped them get to heaven sooner. So people were seeing them as buying your way into heaven. A lot of people had a problem with that practice. A lot of people also had a problem with what the indulgences were being sold for, like why the priests were selling those indulgences. They were using that money to do some of those corrupt practices that we just talked about, like funding the building of cathedrals and churches and things like that, and not really using them the way that the Catholic Church really intended them to be used. So that is, in a nutshell, how people were really questioning the church and why people were calling for a reform in the church. And the last point we're going to talk about are some early reformers. These men were both Christian humanists, which we talked about humanists during the Renaissance, and said that humanists were essentially people who believed in the abilities of humans, of man. And so John Wycliffe and John Huss, the Pope had no earthly power, no right to make decisions for people here on earth, and that the Bible had more authority than the Pope or the church leaders. The Pope and the church leaders had set themselves up kind of as, I shouldn't say God on earth, but for lack of a better word, God on earth. They judged, they made decisions. They were the ones who told you, if you sinned, what you had to do to be forgiven for those sins, things like that. And so they had a lot of authority over people. They didn't let people read the Bible themselves. The Bibles were in Latin so that the priest held the knowledge of the church and they had to give it to the people. So these Christian humanists said that the Pope didn't have right to do this, that the Bible was the authority, and that people should be able to have a relationship with God and make these decisions. So that's essentially, they were the ones who really started this movement way before it even started, of kind of thinking, hey, something's not really right here. And John Wycliffe in particular is especially important because he translated the Bible into English vernacular, which I think we've talked about vernacular before, but vernacular just means the spoken language. So that people in England at the time could actually read the Bible. So that was a big change. And all of this was kind of just propelled and gained a lot of momentum because of the printing press, which we'll talk about later. But the printing press made print materials available and really spread these ideas throughout all of Europe. So that in a nutshell are the causes of the Reformation, and we'll talk more specifically about some people and some specific movements in certain areas in our next videos. So, thanks.